Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
It's nice of you all to be here on a cold night. I'm glad to be here. It's cold. I noticed that. It's my first trip to Canada as an adult, and it was really it's cold. But I was very happy that the team that welcomed me here from the planning committee gave me, among other things, a University of Ottawa ear band. So I'm taken care of, and my heart is warm because I'm happy to be with you, and thank you for welcoming me. And I just wanted to talk a bit about faith, about sorrow, about human rights violations, about mental illness, about where is God in a world that doesn't look beloved to my eyes and perhaps to yours, and how do we search for meaning in a broken world wherever we are in our faith journey. Mine actually in lifetime's work in international human rights sort of brought me to faith, but it also kept me away from faith, and that might be an interesting story for you. I hope it is, because if you think it is interesting, you can go out and each buy 150 copies of my book and send my children to college. I'd appreciate that very much. So speaking of my children, when my little girl Gracie was 4 and her little sister was 2, the kids and my husband were meeting me at the airport. I was coming back from Iowa back to Washington, D.C. on an airplane, and I had been in Iowa to do some political organizing on the behalf of the Ban Landmines campaign. And it's fun to tell the story in Canada because your foreign minister is the author of one of the great miracles of diplomacy and of human rights, which was the Mine Ban Treaty. Lord Axworthy is, as you all know, I hope, was the author of the Mine Ban Treaty, which has probably saved more lives than just about anything else I can name, and it emanated from a real break with tradition in the way that treaty came about. Anyway, the organization I worked for at the time, Physicians for Human Rights, was a founding member of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines that supported the Canadian landmine treaty. And I was out in Iowa for the early American presidential primaries, which is really the only place that I happen to be from Iowa originally, and it's a place uniquely in this sort of insane American political process where you can actually get very, very close to the candidates. You can live with them if you want to. You can eat every meal with them, but they are uniquely accessible to Iowans in that primary window. And so we were trying to get American support for the Mine Ban Treaty, which the rest of the civilized world was busily ratifying, and our government hung back, and still does, I might add, to my dismay. But I took out to Iowa the 2 people who had accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, Jody Williams and a Cambodian man named Ton Chenaret. And he goes by the name Rhett. Chenaret is his first name. And Ton Chenaret is to this day a mine ban activist who, on the back of a motorcycle, went all over Cambodia and collected something like 1 million signatures on a petition to the king to ban the landmine treaty, and indeed Cambodia was one of the early signers. Rhett is a mine ban he is a landmine survivor. He has double amputations. He lost his legs when he stepped on a landmine. He was a soldier, a resistant soldier in Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge was in power, and one leg blew off, the other was damaged, and he ended up cutting off the damaged leg with an axe that he had. He wanted to kill himself with the axe, but soldiers wrested it away from his hands, and he lived. He had reason to live, and it was to fight this weapon and help its victims, which he did and does to this day. He ended up helped by a Jesuit relief service program became a wheelchair builder, and and then a mind band activist, and a more life-filled person I don't think I've ever met. But he's a stunning figure. He rides around in this wheelchair that he built that uses bicycle wheels and wooden seat, and it's fabulous. And he has one amputation above the knee and the other below, and he wears shorts to give him maximum mobility. He's very muscular, very strong, pulls himself in and out of that wheelchair, swings himself with his arms with great great physical strength. Anyway, so I brought him back to Washington with me, Jody and Brett, back to Washington, and we were then going to have some meetings with policymakers, and again, in an attempt to try to get the Mind Band Treaty signed. This is about 1999 or so. Anyway, so I knew my kids, I hadn't seen him for 5 or 6 days, and I was really missing him, and they're little, and I knew that Rhett was going to be coming off the plane behind me, and I had been talking to him about my kids. He's the father of 6 little kids and loves children, and so I came out off the jetway, and I see my family, and there's the little girls, and I only had time to say, you know, my friend is coming. You be polite. That's all I had time to say before Rhett came rolling down the jetway. And little Josie, who was 2, was just hid behind her dad's legs, as any, you know, reasonable 2-year-old would do. But Grace was game, and Rhett rolled right up to her and shook her little hand, and they immediately got into he speaks English, he got into a spirited conversation about his wheelchair and how he'd built it, and she's a personable little chappie herself, and it was great, it was fine. So he then, a colleague of mine was there to help him with his bags and get him into a hotel, and I joined my family, and we went to go get our car, and my little girl said, first question that you would expect, and I don't know why I didn't expect it, but she said, what happened to his legs? And I said, they were blown away. And she looked at me very soberly and with her big eyes and said, Mommy, the wind could never do that. And it was so adorable. But to me, it really, it's such a tender story, and I so loved her for it. And then I had to find words to explain to a little girl in her happy home in Washington, D.C., who had no idea about what blown away could possibly mean other than a dandelion puff, you know, or a balloon that is let loose of its string. That's what blown away means. And of course, the wind could never do that, because she didn't know what Cambodian and Mozambican and Angolan and you know, kids know all too well, Somali kids know all too well what blown away means, and because they live among people who've stepped on that weapon that is left in the ground and will be blowing up children's legs and adults' legs and limbs and blinding them for years to come. They know all about that, but she doesn't, and that is such a stark summary of the randomness of suffering and loss and pain in the world. My kid, who doesn't even know what that means, versus her counterpart in Somalia, where I was told Somali women would tie their kids to a tree, and they would be able to play in a radius of about this far from the tree, which they knew to be landmine free. But stepping out of that area might mean their death. And I thought about that at the time, and I've thought about it many times since. But I can tell you that my exposure to suffering, and all of ours, but in my case was a very good reason not to believe in God. I had plenty of evidence of God's heartlessness or powerlessness or non-existence. You can pick. I don't know what I found the most distressing at the time. Either God was real and didn't care, which is a horrifying prospect, or God was real and was weak, in which case, why bother to worship, or there was no God at all. And I think, given those choices, the least painful thing for me, I was raised as a Christian and a devout one at that, but for me, the least painful choice was to just think that there isn't a God at all, as opposed to the other couple of choices. And really nothing I saw in the in the human rights field up until about 7 or 8 years ago made me change my mind very much. I just got madder and madder. Though, as I was telling Sid this morning when we were talking, I'm not sure you could call me an atheist, because if you don't believe, then you wouldn't be shaking your fist at God and cursing him on a daily basis. And that's more or less where I was at. So I think I really did have a hope that there would be a good God, and I believe that there ought to be a good God, but did not see that. I think you've heard the expression that you can either, this was attributed to Elie Wiesel, though I've never actually seen the quote, and I don't know if the wonderful Elie Wiesel actually said this, but you can either believe in a good God who works his way in the world and is sovereign in the world, or you can believe in the Holocaust, but not both. Not both. And I certainly knew the Holocaust was real, and it had, to this day, stands to me as the great evidence of the anti-God. The space where God was not, and it is something that we all, and every subsequent atrocity, Syria, is much on my mind today as it is, I expect, on yours, because it is of the piece of that what I viewed to be not God's space. I had other reasons not to believe. In fact, I actually made a decision not to believe in God when I was 16. I sometimes laugh when I talk to the young interns and young people that come to International Justice Mission, where I work now. They're all Christian, and they are just lovely, heartfelt Christians. And many of them will talk about coming to Christ and coming to faith, when they were 16 or so. And my experience, I wish it was theirs, but it is not. It's my own. I made a decision against God when I was 16 years old, and it was because and it was considered and serious. My grandmother was a Mennonite missionary in India. My grandparents were, and my dad was born in India and lived there for the first 20 years of his life. And my grandmother was a huge influence in my life. I was closer to her than to either parent. And she was just as close to a vision of a saint as you could imagine, just lovely and kind and so eloquent and joyful in her faith. And, my vision of what a Christian was all about was my beloved grandmother. Well, my grandfather died of cancer, and she had a mental breakdown and really fell completely apart. I didn't know it at the time. I was 16. I didn't know it at the time, but she actually had a very profound mental breakdown when her first husband, my dad's biological father, died of typhoid in India. He was a missionary and died before my dad was born, and she had a period of sort of cataclysmic depression in India. As a young bride and a missionary, and she describes to me later in her life this period of just blackness. But what I saw and experienced, I was sad that my step-grandfather died, but she was devastated, and what really devastated her most profoundly was that she lost her faith. And I was with her. I saw her and heard her calling to God for comfort and saying that God had abandoned her. Many years later, when I read the letters of Mother Teresa, which I recommend, but it is brace yourself. It is a tough read. I very much resonated with my grandmother's experience. Here's this profoundly faithful, loving, deeply religious woman who feels abandoned by God and that loss is as profound as the joy and the passion and the love for the Lord that preceded it. But my grandmother was devastated and terribly ill. She barely spoke for about a year, and she almost died. But she came back to life. She got better, and she came back to her faith, just as passionately and eloquently. She was very intellectual as she ever had. But I didn't come back to my faith. Having it's when you're 16 or when you're 59, it's hard anyway to try to keep a relationship going. Like, where are you? Am I making this up? But when you're 16 and you saw your grandmother abandoned, I just thought, oh heck, or something like that. And I literally made a decision that that's a bunch of crap, and I sort of went through the motions and, until I graduated from high school, but had nothing to do with church or Christians from that time on. And then I would say a third reason that made it easier to be estranged from Christians and from God. It's not an excuse, but it was a factor. Was in this time period, I'm quite, in my personal life, I'm quite liberal. I'm a feminist. I'm very liberal, and I'm a feminist. And the rise of in America of the Christian right wing and the association with America, sort of the juxtaposition of right wing politics and very conservative Christianity was very off-putting to me. And instead of actually meeting some Christians and doing some exploring and asking questions and seeking, I just let other people's, religion and religious practice and political views be all I knew about God, and I didn't like it a bit. So that was enough for me, and I simply went my merry way for almost my entire adult life. So, I would say I did get involved in the international human rights field by accident, because I think, or God's design, but certainly nothing I put in motion. Just, as a music major, clueless about what was going to happen next. I just stumbled into my first job where I was working for Congress, and had the great good fortune to work for an activist member of the House who's now in the Senate, Tom Harkin of Iowa, and got a chance to be very involved in international human rights activism and in foreign policy work, and I've been doing it ever since. But I didn't find God in all that. And I might have if I had not erected such staunch intellectual defenses against the very idea of God, because in the human rights field there was evidence of people who served God and loved God, who were leading in the human rights field. And I'm thinking particularly about the Catholics in Latin America, and I think about the Archbishop of El Salvador, who lost his life saying Mass, and the 4 church women who were raped by the military and killed, who laid down their lives for the poor and the wounded who they loved. And the Catholic leadership in Chile and Brazil and elsewhere, who were on the front lines of international human rights work. Why I didn't associate that with God, and instead decided Jerry Falwell would be the picture of Jesus's face, I don't know. Stupidity, ignorance, bigotry, a couple of choices there. But I would say, for both in my personal life, my faith journey, and my professional life, the Rwanda genocide was a real low. And I say that with an apology. I think it was a bigger low for the people of Rwanda, let me just say. It was an appalling, terrible, our Holocaust on our watch in our day. And I was at what I thought was the top of my game, very pleased with myself, doing really good work for an excellent human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, some of you may know, still doing superb human rights work to this day. I had the great good fortune to be there with them for 14 years, and we were just working so hard during the genocide. We had lots of information. We watched it unfold, and nothing we did made a bit of difference. And I was brought closer to the suffering because of my friendship with a wonderful woman, Alison Desforges, who was Human Rights Watch's Rwanda and Burundi expert. And Alison actually lived in Buffalo, but came down to Washington to work with me, stayed with us for a good deal of time, and worked out of the Washington office just day and night, desperately trying to get the U.S. government to lead some kind of a response, to try to stand up anything to protect the Tutsi minority from the killers. And it just didn't work. But I was close to her, and this is pre-internet, so she was getting faxes and phone calls from her friends in Kigali, and they were in hiding. They were Tutsi friends of hers, because she'd lived in Rwanda for many years, and they were in hiding, and they would call and they say, when are the UN forces coming? When are the troops coming? And we can't hold on much longer. And day after day, they would stop calling until literally every single friend was dead. And I was with her the day she got the news that her teacher, her Rwandan teacher, had died, along with his wife and year-old baby. And it just was unbearable. And I was so if I hadn't believed in a good God, I'd at least believed in good us. Like, here we are, we were writing and testifying and, speaking on the radio and doing everything. And it just was useless. It was such a profound moment of just complete despair and absolute fury with God. Fury. How could this be? And I suppose a lot of people felt that way. But one person who did not feel that way was Gary Haugen. Gary Haugen is my boss. He is the founder of International Justice Mission, and he's pretty cool. He came to visit me. I actually knew Gary before he started IJM. He came to talk to me. I was at Human Rights Watch at the time, and he came to talk to me, and I was not a Christian and didn't like Christians. And in walks this guy who you can see from 30 paces is an evangelical. He's got the hair, he's got the tie, and the smile, the clean cut, and I actually loved him. I thought he was awesome. He had actually just come back from Rwanda. He was working at the Justice Department as a lawyer in the Civil Rights Division, and when the United Nations needed to stand up an investigative team, the U.S. seconded Gary, among others, to go to Rwanda. And he went, and leaving at home his wife and newborn twin girls, and went to Rwanda for 3 months. And was there. He was much closer to the killings than I ever got. And he was there and had the experience of seeing the thousands and thousands of corpses in the churches. People had flocked to the churches seeking sanctuary where none was to be had. And more people were killed in churches than anywhere else in Rwanda. And in some cases, the church was complicit with the killings, and in some cases, the nuns and the priests and the followers of Jesus died with their Tutsi counterparts. It went both ways. But Gary came back with a very different feeling about the Rwanda genocide than I did. He came back thinking, how can I, as a follower of Jesus and as a lawyer, do something from the perspective of my faith about violence? And he came to talk to me. I liked him. I like to tell people that IJM was really all my idea, since he talked with me first. But he had this vision that was two-part. He wanted to figure out a way that there could be a way that some Americans, and now it's much more than Americans, we have 550 staff that are in 14 countries overseas, and the Americans are just the ones in Washington. But how can we do something from our perspective as Christians, and I was not one when I heard about this, to help people that are victims of violence, rape, common garden variety violence, do something. And the other thing he wanted to do was he wanted to change the heart of the church, and particularly the mainstream Protestant and evangelical church, which is his spiritual home. And he wanted to go sort of do what he could to bring the church back to its roots of leading in the abolition of slavery in our country, for example, a history of activism and for justice in the name of Jesus that is not so familiar. It certainly wasn't familiar to me, but it is actually just true. That religious people were also the backbone of the civil rights movement here, and a host of other things, but had not been so present in modern day justice struggles. And that was his other goal with IJM. And I was not a believer, but I thought, boy, we really need this kind of Christian support for an international human rights movement. And I thought he was the real deal. And, Gary was a big part of my faith journey, not because of anything he said, but just because of the way he was. He's a man who lives in joy and in and in generosity, who just radiates a kind of something that I knew I didn't have, but I wanted it. Anyway, we became great good friends. My husband and I got to be good friends with him and his wife, who's truly fall down hilarious, which cuts a wide swath with me, and just got to know this little fledgling organization. And we did talk a lot about the Rwanda genocide. And I remember some years after we met, when IJM was just getting off the ground, and I said to him, I was angry that he could even believe in the God that had permitted the Rwanda genocide. And I said, how could you? How can you? And because to me, believing would mean breaking faith with all those victims. And he said, I don't know why the Rwanda genocide happened or why God allowed, but I don't know. And he was okay with not knowing. But he said, I know this. I know that those killings and that death is not all God has in mind for all of those little ones who died, and that he will wipe every tear from their eyes. And I didn't know he was quoting from Scripture. I know it now. But I never forgot that. It was just something that stuck in my brain. And because he said it and I trusted him, I just thought, I didn't believe it and I didn't share that view, but it mattered to me and it stuck there and like a burr. And I think that really my whole experience with faith is just a lot of burrs. Even so, I was a slow learner. So in any event, I became very good friends with IJM and just a few things to help out the organization from my perch at Human Rights Watch and then at Physicians for Human Rights. And I think there were all kinds of signposts on the way to coming to believe in God, as I did about 8 years ago. Oh, is there a baby here? How wonderful. I was just about to talk about babies, actually, when I heard that little squeak. Adopting our kids was, even though I didn't become a believer until about 10 years later, there was something about that sense of just profound wonder when our Chinese daughter was put into my arms, a little scrawny thing at 4 months of age. And I just was so amazed and dazed by love and gratitude that I just had a very strong sense that absolutely nothing that I've done in life makes me actually deserving of this miracle, and that something a great deal larger and kinder than I am is responsible for this. But I didn't have a name for it, and then I was just busily going about my life. I would say, though, that getting to know other IJMers was affected me increasingly profoundly, and in along about 2003, I had an experience about really getting to see what IJM was actually doing. This was fairly new in the organization's life, but in that time period, IJM, which did not yet have an office in Cambodia, got some reports from development people in the country that there was a neighborhood outside of Phnom Penh where very, very young girls were being sold for sex. So IJM sent some investigators undercover, posing as Western pedophiles, to Cambodia to basically see what was going on. And in those days, and this is just 10 years ago, in those days you just, you're a Western man, you just get on the back of a motorbike and go into this area, Svay Pak, and Western men only came to that area for one reason. Actually it's a Vietnamese enclave outside of Phnom Penh, Cambodia, where Vietnamese diaspora lives, and indeed, there were very, very young girls for sale, and teen boys would simply take you, if you want small, go to a house, a shack, really, and within minutes you can be negotiating for the purchase of a kid as young as 5. And so they took undercover film footage of this horror. They developed, as IJM always does, developed a dossier of lots of information with undercover pictures of the transaction, the money changing hands, the perpetrators, the names, ages of the kids, the video of the kids, the negotiation of, allegedly trying to buy a kid, who of course were never violent. needless to say. It was all fake to get the evidence to take to the authorities and show them what was going on. And they looked at that film and looked at the sort of police blotter style dossier that we'd put together, the IJM team had put together, and said thank you very much, and didn't do a thing about it. So an IJMer named Sharon Cohn, who became my great good friend, who I knew at the time, asked if she could come and meet with me, and could I get a couple other human rights activists together to talk about what to do, because there's nothing that, I mean, they couldn't just steal the kids out of the brothels. You have to work through the justice system. Otherwise, you're kidnapping. That will not work. You can't just buy slaves out. So they absolutely had to have the Cambodian police and justice system respond to this open, clear, vile abuse, and going on under everybody's noses. But IJM were the ones that just said, this is intolerable. Like, where are the grown-ups? Oh, there aren't any. It's us, and we're going to have to do something about this, because that's how they just roll. And it's so interesting to me, because in all my years in the human rights field, you see all these terrible things, and though I'd never seen anything like that, and so you go back and report on them, but it's so much safer to do that at 30,000 feet. You don't have to actually imagine, well, how's this little child going to actually get out of this brothel? I mean, is the rescue ferry going to come down? The report is not going to get this kid out. And it's just intolerable. There's just something so immediate about that. And for me, it was particularly painful. I have, our second daughter is Vietnamese, and she was 5 when Sharon brought over this undercover film footage and showed it to me. And the kids were still in the brothels when I saw those films. It was the most appalling thing I'd ever seen in my life. And the youngest child in the undercover film footage was Josie's age, my girl's age, and the kids in the film were Vietnamese, because the Vietnamese kids were it's a despised minority in Cambodia, and the youngest kids available for exploitation are invariably Vietnamese. My kid is Vietnamese, and you know what? It just actually could have been her. And it just could have been her. And I know exactly how little those kids are, because I still could carry Josie around on my hip. She was that little, just a little pea, weighed 35 pounds. And to see those children being offered for sex and haggling over the money, it just absolutely killed me. And I didn't take time out to curse God, though I might have on another day. But my first thought was, well, what can we do to help on this? And we did help a little. We contacted the State Department on behalf of IJM and got arranged a meeting with the U.S. ambassador, and things started to break loose. And in fact, IJM, Sharon led the mission, went back several months later, and the police did a rescue and pulled 35 children out of the brothels. 10 were under the age of 10. And we've been in Cambodia ever since. And today, you will not find any young kids in the brothels at all, because it has basically been stamped out through immense effort on the Cambodians' part and on our part and on God's part. But it really did present a very vivid picture of kind of the difference between what I was doing in my life, of which, and I don't mean in any way to speak disparagingly about the work of human rights monitoring and reporting and advocacy, which I've done for 25 years. And very glad to have had the privilege of doing that. But I do think that there is this protective layer from being an observer, then actually entering in and trying to do something to make that little girl or that adult slave or that widow whose property's been snatched, make their life different. So from a spiritual sense, IJM also gave me a different answer to that truly terrible sort of dualism that I have always had in my mind. Either you can believe in, say, the Rwanda genocide, or you can believe in a good God, but not both simultaneously. But IJM offered a third answer. And the answer was, it's probably obvious to many of you, it certainly was not to me, even though I'd known IJM for many years, but the answer was that God hates injustice. despises it and says out loud and in English and French over and over in the scripture about what he wants his people to do about it, which is, you know, plead for the widow and the orphan and protect the poor and you know, rebuke injustice. It's all over the place. Now that happens not to be scripture I memorized back when I was really hating Christians and Christianity. I was busy looking at, alternatively, say, Leviticus. But it, you know, which is not for the faint of heart and probably not the place to start out. But, you know, somehow I managed to miss all of this incredibly clear scripture, Old and New Testament, about God's great heart for justice and hatred of violence and this incredible passion for the poor and the weak. And you see that everywhere. And IJM, you know, those guys, Bible-believing literalists that they are, take those words absolutely literally. So the question then becomes not where was God during the Holocaust or the Rwanda genocide or the rape of women and girls in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Syria where 11,000 men were just tortured and executed this week, but where are the people of God? Because God's view on this kind of thing is crystal clear. And it became clear to me that there was an alternative answer to the questions I was posing rather fruitlessly and not coming up with good answers. And I think once the intellectual barriers to belief were starting to come down, so I could begin to imagine that in theory, it was possible that there could be God and that God might actually be good. Simultaneously, I was sort of in a personal crisis of my own where I actually felt God's presence. Just for the fun of it, I'll tell you about that. I don't see anybody leaving. How is the date night couple? Still with me? I'm so glad. I think that I wrote a book, and it was to keep my mind alive. You know, I was very happy to have found sort of the experience of faith, just a glimmer, and having seen that little bitty shard of light, I then wanted to chase after it for the rest of my life. But the world hadn't changed at all. You know, I had changed, but the world hadn't changed a bit. So I wrote these things down to keep questioning, to keep not doubt alive, but to keep faith alive. But what really has been the most profound experience for me was grew out of just a personal crisis, and I think authentically that's where many of us find ourselves. It's just in brokenness and in total defeatedness, where we've just gone to the end of the line with our own smartness, cuteness, slimness, cleverness, sassiness, whatever, you know, you got. And it's just not working for us. And that was exactly the place I was at. And you know, with just a little soupçon of mental illness thrown into the mix to keep things festive. I have anxiety disorder. Didn't know it. I thought everybody, like, counted and typed in their brain and had music going through their head all the time. And I mean, and not the Brandenburgs necessarily. It could be Bingo was his name-o, anything. The last thing I heard, like, roaring through my head, I thought everybody had that. My dad has that. But, you know, I come from a long line of crazies, and it you know, I came by this very honestly, but when I was in my late 40s, things really, really got, mid-40s, late 40s, I had a tremendous upsurge of just clinical free-floating anxiety. And, you know, because I'm from the Midwest and of sturdy stock, I just thought I could gut this out because that's how I roll. And this is all just weakness. Now, why I would be so boneheaded and bigoted about mental illness, I don't know, since my beloved grandmother had profound mental illness her whole life. She had many breakdowns after that first one, but it couldn't be me. So of course I didn't get medication until I was just a mess. But I remember very, very vividly my first and the most powerful experience I've had of that there is a God who knows me and is actually with me. Was I was talking in my head, which is part of how my brain was working in those days, pre-meds, and just having all this roaring noise and terrible anxiety. Just if you don't have anxiety disorder, you just have to take my word for it that it's a bitch. And you just you have insomnia, and you shake for no reason. You get these adrenaline surges. You talk all the time. You wouldn't have guessed I have this disorder, would you? But I just felt so defeated by this. And I was telling Jason and Carrie that my little daughter, Josie, was about 6 at the time, just a great kid, love her to death. She's 16 now. She was just in this state where she'd get so mad. She would just rampage, just screech and reject me. And I didn't know what to do. And I just felt like I was failing as a mom, and I just felt so lousy, and I was so alone. Never mind that I have a great husband, wonderful colleagues. I just was busted. And I just remember praying to someone I did not believe existed, help, 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 help. One word prayer. And I just felt like calmer. Now, it didn't cure the anxiety disorder. I ended up getting great meds. And my 3 sisters who are not believers think that it's the meds, not the Lord. And I think it's both. I think that Jesus is perfectly capable of coming up with great psychopharmaceuticals. So I'm very grateful for them. But because I was not a believer when I prayed this prayer and got this help, of course I thought it was a fluke. I thought it was a coincidence. So I didn't pray again for 3 months. Because I'm an idiot. But I just didn't tell anyone about that. And I certainly, after having not been a believer and having a big investment in that my whole life, I just was a little embarrassed, didn't know what to say. But I did find myself gradually, when I felt not just anxious, but when I felt small, when I felt mean, when I felt impatient or unloving, which is not most of the time. I'm really very nice. But often, daily life, where I just wasn't living in joy and generosity. I would just throw up a flare and just say, help. And somehow, just in that moment, things would just be different. And I think that for all the intellectual inquiry that I like to think I'm having, I read a lot of theology. I love to talk about the case for and against God. I'm very passionately a seeker. I'm a doubter, and I think that's good. But at the end of the day, the most authentic experience of God is in our own hearts, and it's a mystery to me, and it's a precious mystery, but nonetheless very very real for all of that. So I do still have doubts. And funnily, working for IJM is, you might think you'd have less doubts working in a Christian organization. I'm surrounded by marvelous, marvelous people whose faith is very strong and very mature, unlike mine. I'm a complete toddler. But in fact, the casework is so difficult and so painful that it riles up these same feelings of why. Because now we have not only the randomness of suffering, but we're experiencing the randomness of rescue. Why did God let us see these girls in this brothel and not those? And I don't have any answers for that. And those very questions which had turned me against God before do not turn me against God now. I'm trying to become content to say, I don't know. But the fact that I don't know does not mean that God is bad. I don't know, and God is good. And I don't know, but my colleagues are showing, and many, many others are showing up every single day to do good things. And people who are, I think God is in every good and generous and kindly and protective and loving and true thing. And so that means there's a whole lot of people, believers, non-believers, believers of different faiths, who, when they are contributing to the sum total of beauty in the world, God is in that. That is my belief. I think that does not mean I think all faiths are the same. I know I'm a Christian, but I do believe that the creator of the universe is in all things that are good. And I can stay in the human rights field and actually be very close to, much closer than I was as a policy activist and a lobbyist for my previous jobs, which I loved, and be much closer to randomness and much closer to suffering, really just ghastly, ghastly cruelties. But somehow just believe truly that God is in that, and that is, well, that's my story. I see that I've gone on for quite a long time, longer than I expected. So I'm going to stop in hopes that there will be some energy in the room to hear your comments and questions. Please.
Well, I'd like to basically thank you for sharing your story. I've actually gone through similar challenges in terms of my spiritual walk with questioning how could there be a God and questioning how could there be such evil. I just have a question. I personally believe that suffering hasn't necessarily been created by God. I believe that there is, since beginningless, there is suffering, because there's this dichotomy between how do you know what is good if you don't know what is evil. And I think that that's the situation. We can't have light without darkness. We can't conceive what is day if we never have night. And I'd like to hear your comment on the fact that suffering, good, evil is, and there is really probably only the option of learn how to deal with it rather than trying to eliminate it. I'd like to basically hear what you think about that.
It's a profound thought and question. It's a different way of thinking about things that I have not, though I do, to my amazement, having become a believer, found to my amazement that my own and others' experience of God's presence is most profound in suffering, which you said. Because my whole worldview before becoming a believer was that because of suffering, other people's suffering, I, who lead a very privileged life with every good thing in it, don't have any right to experience joy in my suffering, in my joy because of others' suffering. But it is in fact precisely in suffering that people do experience God's presence. But I think we're going to live in a world that there will always be suffering, and whatever we believe, each one of us is going to die. Each one of us is going to lose people we love, and we will be racked, and we will suffer very greatly. But I think that God wants us to act against gratuitous cruelty and exploitation, which is suffering, but it is, I think we're called to act on our original belovedness, all of us. And that, particularly for those of us that live in privilege and in freedom, imposes certain obligations. I don't think God is responsible for suffering, and I also think that, and I think the Lord, the Creator, He or She is in it, but I'm not quite with you about it being inevitable or necessary to understand the difference. But maybe I didn't hear you well. Are there any other comments on that, or do you want to say something further?
Well, yeah, thanks for your feedback. I actually came from a Mormon background, and I've actually been studying a lot of Buddhism. And what I guess I'm trying to say is that I think you're right that we have to find a way to deal with suffering in that. But I find that basically, like you said, we can't just say, God eliminated. I think we have to actually step down and say, hey, what can we do about it? And I'm personally working on transforming my mind in terms of like eliminating my greed, finding ways, because Buddhism is all about how to handle your negative emotions. And once you bridle your negative emotions in your mind, then it has byproduct in terms of society. So that's my spirituality, is learning how to handle my personal negative emotions, and hopefully that will have an impact in society.
I'm so interested to hear of that.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for sharing, sir.
Thank you for the talk tonight. There are, however, thousands countless of proposed gods throughout the world. So I'm basically wondering, as a Christian, to what extent do you believe that the Bible makes accurate claims about our world that other religious texts do not?
Well, it's an excellent question. I don't know if I do justice to the depth of the question, but what I think you're asking about is the Bible the depiction of reality? You know, I am one who believes that the Bible, that Jesus is real and was historically real. I'm not a literalist in terms of what the Bible says, and I think it's hard for any of us to be anyone to be literalist about any of the sacred texts from any religion. I am a literalist when it comes to Jesus being divine and the Son of God. But is the Bible a depiction of our world today? It was written, it was written by a bunch of individuals a very, very long time ago. So if you're asking, do I believe that every word is true, in some contexts, it is true. It is a true depiction of how the Jewish people experienced God, many, many hundreds of thousands of years ago. And I think the New Testament is what we know of Jesus on the earth. But the rest of your question, do I think that's superior to other worldviews? I'm a believer. I'm a Christian, and I think that it is true. So, yes, I guess I'd say I think that. But what do you think?
I personally believe that there's probably a figure like Jesus, but I'm not convinced that the Bible is necessarily a reliable source of information.
Well, I think I think there's so much in the Bible, of information or about how to live our lives. I mean, I happen to think that Jesus is an extraordinary inspiration to how to live life, and we've never seen the likes since. So that's what I believe as a Christian, and I find it more interesting and more demanding and more extraordinary with every read. But then there are things in the Bible I don't know what to make of. The book of Job just kicks my ass every time I read it. It's like, what? What is that? So, but it is an extraordinary thing. It's there to learn from. C.S. Lewis said something like, it's there for our learning. And I like to think that. There's some stories that I think in the Bible that I think are not for our learning, like Lot and his two daughters. Please, don't even go there. But I don't take every word of the Bible literally, but I take it seriously. So that's the best I can do.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for asking.
It's an honor to meet you.
Thank you.
I guess from my perspective as a Christian and my perspective especially the last 10 years, over the last 10 years, I've lost my father, my husband, and my mother. And it was overwhelmingly sad. But every single one of them got the message at the end of how much they were loved by literally thousands of people who they had helped over their long lives. And that was such a gift. And when I think back on the Holocaust and on the genocide in Rwanda, overwhelmingly sad. And yet, you look at the heroes who saved lives, who performed kindnesses for people in crisis. Paul, and I can never pronounce his name, but Milcolane, who saved 2,000 people. Oscar Schindler, Colonel Romeo Dallaire, who stood up as much as he was allowed to. Thousands of people. And I think one of the messages that I take from God from those is it's our job to stand up. It's our job to speak up, to do what we can. We may not be able to save thousands of lives, but we may be able to save one life.
Thank you for that. You know, that was it sounds probably trite for me to say this, but it was really a sort of mind shift, paradigm shift for me in sort of coming to believe, albeit reluctantly, in a good God, to basically take a look at what was going on and say, well, wait a minute, God didn't do that. We did that. I mean, the Holocaust was, you know, and if you imagine what would it have looked like during the Holocaust if Christians, if the people of God had acted like Jesus? You can't even imagine it, right? You know, the people that ran Buchenwald and Auschwitz were Christians. What would it have looked like if the people of God had showed up in His name? Well, we get a new chance every day. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I wanted to defer to the people who are students here. I'm not. But thank you very much.
Are you sure you're not?
I, like everyone else, greatly appreciated your presentation. I would like to push back just a little bit. You know, it sounds like it appeals particularly to those of us who are in positions where we can act, where we can do something, where we can speak out or work against injustice. But there are many people in the world who really, you know, what they can do is very, very limited, if anything. They are at the victim end. That doesn't invalidate what you have said at all, but I'm wondering if you could translate what you said so that it could be understood maybe from that angle.
It is, you've really put your finger on some of the hardest question, I think, for me and for many people about faith, which is just the truly the degraded who don't have the remotest potential to live in joy or gratitude, much less help themselves or anyone else. And I do a bit of work on the issue of people with mental disability. I'm served on board of a wonderful organization called Disability Rights International, and those of you with spare money should instantly get it out and send it to Disability Rights International. They're just phenomenal, and they work on behalf of adults and children who, if there ever was evidence of those God abandoned, it's them. Children with spina bifida and mental retardation and tied to beds and just die in institutions all over the world by the millions, and or people who have profound mental illness and whose own minds, that which we can imagine the creator or imagine not the creator or question, transformation through Jesus or through Buddhism, is their own minds are their enemies and are attacking them. What did you have in mind, Lord? What exactly? And I asked that question many times because of my own experience of my grandmother's very profound mental illness, and because of my association with these people that are doing work on behalf of truly those that are the most abandoned by all. And all I can say is that my friends at DRI happen not to be Christians, but I'm completely persuaded that everything they do is God-infused, and their sense of the immense value of these little children with Down syndrome, who nobody wants and nobody holds and nobody talks to, and their fight for them, they just fight for them every day, and they won't save them. God has an eternity to make it right and will. But on this earth, here on this earth, they are here to say those kids, they are valuable. And so they are. And I just think we know that because our Creator made them and said they are valuable. And I don't know. I just think, too, those have been given much, much is expected. And that's us, folks. And it is, we shouldn't have to wait until heaven to see an end of slavery, for example, in our time. Let's not.
I guess I like attention. Actually, I don't, but I was actually reading this book by Omar Mikhail Ernov, and he talks about evil like being like electricity or like a storm or like the wind. In science, we've able to find ways to domesticate it. So before thunders and all that used to make people have to go in caves, but now we use it to have appliances. Even water used to be something that was negative, but now we found ways to use as well, and we find ways to use all these forces. And basically Omar talks about that's who God is. God isn't this being that is the root of evil, but he transcends evil in that he finds ways to use it, just like a chemist or a doctor finds ways to use bacteria to cure certain illnesses. God has been able to transcend evil by finding ways to use it. And we see that in the cross when Jesus came and died and then resurrected. These politicians, these Pharisees were evil, but at the same time, God used that to cure the karma that we now have his grace to receive forgiveness. And I think that's where I guess we have to learn, is not to blame evil for evil, but to just, I guess, transcend it through true wisdom and true science. And I guess I want your feedback on that.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I was interested when you mentioned that your friend Gary, who started IGM, his passion was wanting to see evangelical Christians become more involved in human rights and in working for justice. And as an American, seeing the situation in America, what do you think Christians' role currently is, and how do you see it developing in the future? Do you see them having a greater role within this kind of work, or is it still a lot of non-Christians who are passionate about human rights?
Really interesting question and a hard one to answer. I don't have a lot of wisdom on this, but I would say that clearly the Christian church and as well as the other great religions, Judaism and Islam, have been for a long time very much involved with relief, with physical relief. And if we look at the Christian church, for example, the expansion of the Christian church into very extensively the field of relief and refugee resettlement and humanitarian, it was a sort of enormous post-World War development. And now, of course, the Christian churches of various denominations are responsible for billions of dollars worth of contributions to shelter and to water and to food and relocation and education and as well as, of course, the other great tenet of Christian activism in the world, which is evangelism. Jewish congregations very heavily involved in philanthropy. But the area of violence and of desperate need for justice and for protection, the things we would want for our kids, if there was a rapist, in our neighborhoods who was raping, third graders on their way to school, we might, we wouldn't engage in a stand up a Take Back the Night rally. We would get the police in there and they would protect our kids and put the bad guys in jail. That's what the poor don't have in many countries in the world, and that's what the development sort of industry and what our development agencies, including our Christian agencies, are not dealing with. It's new. It's not new, but the challenge is newly brought to our eyes. And IJM is one of the few organizations that is actually right in there, involved in actually the work of trying to get justice for our clients who are little rape victims, et cetera, in local courts, and to help police and prosecutors stand up, a deterrence for this crime. Now, are we all supposed to be doing that? No, I think we're supposed to love what comes across our path, to quote a line from one of my favorite movies, A Year of Living Dangerously, which you should all go see. But where's the American church at? Well, there's a lot of different American churches. The Roman Catholics have long been involved in social justice internationally and domestically. I think the churches are in the forefront of certain kinds of humanitarian assistance. I think the people of God, including most especially me, have a long way to go to actually act as if people only knew one Christian, and it was me. Would they know anything about who Jesus was? Not very much. So I think the radical inclusivity and generosity and availability of Christ, which is what my read of the New Testament is basically what his church should look like. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. That's because we're, unfortunately, humans.
Thank you, as well as everyone else said. But I was in Uganda 2 summers ago, and I got the great privilege of working with a lot of young people there in high schools and different things. And I've never had so little to give away, because I ran out of things to give away. And being there on the front lines, kind of working with people directly, was a great privilege. I'm just curious, what do you think is, I guess, not necessarily that we can choose between one or the other, but what is the greatest good? Is it educating groups like ours and people of privilege to go off and do the work? Or is the greater good to be there with them doing the work? Or, I mean, obviously there's the ability to do both, but is there more to be done here, getting the ball rolling, educating people, telling them about the need, and kind of, I guess, making the world better that way, or being on the front lines?
I think it's all good. I think every bit of it is good. When my kids were little, I read this great book to them, and we love it, and we give it away to everybody we know who's got little kids, called Miss Rumphius. Does anybody know Miss Rumphius? Do you, Carrie? Miss Rumphius is a story about a little old lady who's single. She's the hero of this story, and her grandfather told her she had to do something to make the world a more beautiful place. So she goes off and she sees the world, and but she still hasn't done anything to make the world a better place. So at the end of the book, she plants lupines everywhere. It's the most beautiful thing. But the point of the book was, life is very full, but what did you do to make the world a more beautiful place? And I would not want to privilege one action over another that contributes to goodness. My dad is a concert he was a concert violinist, and he's 93 years old now, and he still plays the violin. And he was a conscientious objector during World War II, and he was a Mennonite, and wasn't really any other option for him, nor did he imagine there would be one. He certainly was a pacifist by his faith. But after the information came out about the Holocaust, he said to me many times as I was growing up that he wondered about whether he had made the right choice, because the evil was so vast, and as a pacifist, he felt uneasy with his pacifism. But you know what he was doing while others were liberating Birkenau, and years too late, I might add? He was, as a conscientious objector, working in institutions for the criminally insane in the United States, which is as close to hell on this earth you can possibly imagine. And because the Quakers and the Brethren and the Mennonites were in there doing their alternative civilian public service during the war, things started to change for the wretched of this earth, who were treated worse than the basest farm animal. So, and now he, for the rest of his life, he, played classical music, and I wouldn't want to live in a world that didn't have it. So this line about you're supposed to love what comes across your path is a pretty hard thing. It comes from The Year of Living Dangerously, this great Australian film about the overthrow of Sukarno, and this little short person, Linda Hunt, exactly, who plays Billy Kwan in the movie, says his view is that you have to love what comes across your path. And that, it won't necessarily be the lovable. We just have to have eyes to see. And wherever we're doing that, whether it's, some obnoxious family member, or whether it's a little old lady down the street who's, boring but needs a visit, or whether it's, agitating on behalf of an Iraqi, a prisoner from the Iraq War, or whether it's, teaching children to sing. It contributes to a better world, and we just need to stay alive to pain. We just need to stay alive to it. Never get used to it. Always move towards it. I personally cannot do that or even imagine doing that without God's help, and I don't do a very good job with that. But that seems to me the way we can live. Well, that was pretty solemn.
Maybe one more question. So, unless there's more people lined up, I think it's probably going to be our last question.
So working with IJM and in the context of Christianity in churches, how do you as a Christian navigate the political sphere, the political climate? And I guess why I'm asking this is because earlier you touched really briefly on how, especially in the U.S., Christianity is very syncretistic with the political right or right-wing interpretation on morality.
It's a good question. Sid and I were talking about that this morning, and the political identification, or my perception of the political identification of Christianity with the far right in American politics was part of what kept me from wanting to be a believer. But at IJM, I would say, I'm a liberal, and I'm on the seeking end of Christianity, and I would say that the majority of my colleagues, if not really almost all of them, are much more mainstream and conservative Christians. But the really great good thing is that we would probably disagree on some of the social issues that are really tearing apart people of faith, tearing apart our churches, and tearing apart our communities. And we don't deal with those issues at IJM, and we don't deal with those as friends and as colleagues. I drew a Venn diagram when Sid and I were talking this morning. If you just imagine it, the three rings that overlap, and there's this little kernel in the middle where the three rings overlap. If you think of Christians as being those three rings, and they're not all going to share the same views. There's going to be, far left liberals like me, and I have my views, and I have my views about what the church's views ought to be, and I have, and there'll be people whose religious views inform their pacifism, and there might be others whose Christian views inform their, being part of the U.S. military, and there might be people on the far political right who have certain views informed by their Christian views, and some on the far left. But what interests me is not the outlier issues that are not fundamental to our faith, but the kernel in the middle. What is it that we all believe that matters the most? And for IJMers, and for the Christians I have the privilege to work with, it is that sense of God's accompaniment and that sense of reliance on God to do this work, and a sense of joy in doing the work as Christians and fellow believers. And that's the kernel. And I think that if we, and I'm really glad we've not let other issues that are not fundamental to our trust in God divide us and weaken our camaraderie in the faith, and weaken the work. I'm grateful for that. And I'm very interested in different conversations and constellations of looking for what is that shared belief that matters most. Because I get sad when I see so many divisions in the faith that are keeping us from companionship with each other in Christ's love. And and to the degree I contribute to that myself as someone with very strong views, I regret it. That's enough from me. Thank you all for coming and spending a great evening with me. I think Sid might want to say something.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.